What is the Schomburg Center? To me, it is home. The place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture. It's a place of history. It's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution.
For the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists at a time when most people didn't believe that. He collected those evidences, and that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all of culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg for me is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment and what I saw these young African Americans doing was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the Cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this Cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the Cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One-Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center is home, it is family, it is foundational.
The Schomburg Center is inspiration.
The Schomburg is with me in everything that I do.
Community, inside and out.
The Schomburg Center is us.
The Schomburg Center is you, and we invite each and every one of you to find your Schomburg Center.
Good evening, good evening. My name is Novella Ford. I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs and Exhibitions, and welcome to Virtual Schomburg, where every month is Black History Month. In this season, we continue to explore radical imagination, creativity, and liberation through programs and exhibitions. In March, as we celebrate Women's History Month, we always turn to women in jazz. And we are grateful to welcome back our annual Women's Jazz Festival concerts taking place in person in the Langston Hughes Auditorium located in Harlem. Our opening night features Alicia Waller and the Excursions, paying tribute to Sarah Vaughan, Miriam Makeba, and Cesaria Abora. We were talking earlier about liberation in music, and there's so much history that you can learn through these kinds of artists. And so we are pleased to present this every month, every year in the month of March as a way of entering Black history. Tickets are now on sale for a limited time. And for a limited time, you can use our discount code DISC10, all one word, for $10 off our general admission tickets. We'll drop a link in the chat. Please also visit our website at schomburg.org to plan your visit and explore our exhibitions, research divisions, public programs, and so much more. And of course, there are our digital collections, which are available online. As you saw in the video, and we can't say it enough, the Schomburg Center is dedicated to the collection, preservation, and interpretation of global Black experiences from the past to the present, and we are so grateful for the scholars who are joining us today. We appreciate you joining us for Conversations in Black Freedom Studies, a virtual roundtable discussion with scholars, the first Thursday of each month. You will hear more about tonight's program from this season's curators, Dr. Robin Spencer, Associate Professor of History at Lehman College and co-creator of the series, Dr. Jean Theo-Harris. Please note, books by tonight's participants are available in person and online via the Schomburg Shop in Harlem, as well as online at schomburgshop.com. All proceeds benefit the Schomburg Center and our public programs and more activities at the Schomburg. You can rewatch tonight's program as well as any of our previous conversations on our YouTube channel, as well as on our live stream page at livestream.com/Schomburg. To introduce you to tonight's program and the participants, I will turn it over to our co-curators, Dr. Robin Spencer and Dr. Jean Theo-Harris. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Novella Ford and Kalila Bates. It's so great to be here. I'm Jean Theo-Harris, Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York. This is the beginning of our 10th season of Conversations in Black Freedom Studies. Kamosi Woodard and I started Conversations in Black Freedom Studies in collaboration with the Schomburg Center a decade ago to create a space where the public could come and engage with new works in Black social movement history. With fewer and fewer public spaces available to engage new work in Black history, Conversations in Black Freedom Studies was conceived of as a way to hear, learn, and discuss new work in Black history that helps us see the present more clearly. In many ways, one of the impetuses behind Conversations was the new and growing field of Black Power studies. And Conversations has gotten to chart that rich and expanding field over the past decade. Tonight's conversation provides yet another iteration in that ongoing conversation, and we're so excited for it. Kamosi took on a more emeritus role last year, and we are thrilled and delighted to welcome Robin C. Spencer, Associate Professor of History at Lehman College, as a co-curator. We are thrilled that the Schomburg Center has continued this series as one of its educational and public programming offerings. As usual, like Novella said, we're here on the first Thursday of each month. We have an exciting lineup ahead. Our next program on Thursday, April 7th, will be on slavery, capitalism, and empire, featuring Adam Getachew, Peter Hudson, Justine Edwards, and Daniel Immerwahr. And our full lineup can always be found at blackfreedomstudies.org. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Robin C. Spencer, Associate Professor of History at Lehman College. We're so delighted in timely conversation on Black Power. Black Power and the questions emanating from that movement have, shaped my entire career. So I'm very excited to have and host this conversation. Black Power, both its local and international iterations. Black Power is a deeply lived experience. Black Power and how it impacts everything from food to health to land to reparations and beyond. And the many, many entangled histories. This has been the goal of conversations from the beginning, to provide the history that we need to see the way forward. This is live streaming to YouTube right now, and we'll put the link in the chat so you can share it to people who might be interested in joining us. And the books that our authors are talking about this evening are available at the Schomburg shop, and we'll be putting the link to that in the chat too, so you can purchase them if you don't already have them. And don't forget to follow us at Schomburg CBFS, at Schomburg CBFS. We're so honored and delighted to welcome tonight's panelists, leading authors, and some of my favorite scholars. DeWeston Haywood, Associate Professor of History at Hunter College, City University of New York, is the author of Let Us Make Men, the 20th Century Black Press, and a Manly Vision for Racial Advancement. Robin Hayes, a writer and director of the award-winning documentary Black in Cuba, creative director of Progressive Pupil, and author of Love for Liberation, African Independence, Black Power, and a Diaspora Underground. Ed Onaci is Associate Professor of History at Ursinus College and author of Free to Land, the Republic of New Afrika, and the Pursuit of a Black Nation State. And Monica White is Gaylord A. Nelson Distinguished Chair in Integrated Environmental Studies and Associate Professor of Environmental Justice at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and author of Freedom Farmers, Agricultural Resistance, and the Black Freedom Movement. We're so excited to get this off the ground, and it's going to be an exciting program.
Yes, we sure are. I think we wanted to start with each of you telling us briefly how you came to this research topic. What concerns or commitments or experiences sort of guide your work and guided you to this topic? And Robin, we'll start with you.
Thanks so much. Well, this project started as a dissertation, and it was actually a film called When We Were Kings about Muhammad Ali and his return to heavyweight fighting in what was then called Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, that really got me interested in the question of how do African Americans and Africans, relate, and how can that relationship be something that lifts up Black liberation for all parties involved. And, it seemed to me that this was an idyllic, kind of an idyllic representation, idealistic representation of that connection, but it was so vivid and powerful in that documentary. I wanted to explore it more. And then, I finished my dissertation, and then, I got interested in documentary filmmaking and made this documentary Black in Cuba. And I kind of returned to the book project when a much less profitable film that some of you may or may not have heard of called Black Panther, of course I'm kidding, with Ryan Coogler came out. And of course, in the first moments of Black Panther, these are the questions, how, maybe we had this sort of idealistic connection with the Black Panther Party in the 60s and 70s, but where is that solidarity and that love now? And so it sort of inspired me to return to the question in book form.
Well, for me, I came to the project in two ways. The first is I finished college, and my first job out was I was charged with the task of co-founding an enhancement program for at-risk young Black men. And I assumed that because we were all Black and male, that we therefore automatically shared commonalities, right? But there were key differences around class, around age, around ideology, around conceptions of manhood. And we would have these conversations about life that invariably turned into conversations about manhood. And we were all certain that we knew what that was, but we so often disagreed, right? So that experience led me to want to know how men become men, and or any of us become a gender identity, for example, and the complex meaning and webs that carries. And then second, when I reached grad school, I took a course examining the American state and citizenship rights, or the relationship between the two, or the lack thereof. And when it was time to write the final paper, I wanted to interrogate the relationship between the state, rights, and masculinity for Black men and white men, particularly the idea that the right to be a man is a right in and of itself. Right. And so fortunately, the professor liked the paper and enjoyed it so much that she said, this needs to be a dissertation. So, you know, these things became the foundations of Let Us Make Men. It's concerned with how we become socialized to think and act in terms of a gender identity. How and why does that identity suffuse claims that we make on rights and the state? How do we produce and reproduce race men? Why and when do we need representative men to lead the race? And as Black feminist scholars have rightly asked, why is racial leadership always gendered male? And if we construct manhood to be something that is essentialized, something that we actually possess, something that's natural, then what do we gain? What do we lose if in that construction?
Yeah, so I came to my research as a youth who was trying to figure out basically how to be an activist, right? That's how all of this begins. I was interested in social movements and wanted to get involved, admittedly, because I thought some of it was kind of glamorous, looking at the Black Panther Party and all those good things. As I got into my research, in fact, first looking more broadly at the Black Power era and looking at the Black Panther Party in particular, I started to see that actually it's very unglamorous, and started to ask, well, how are people affected by participating in social movements in particular? Because, you know, not only is there the daily culture that I find fascinating, but there's also state repression that is very harmful to activists. And in addition to that, I was really interested in land-based movements and was questioning, well, how does the search or the attempt to acquire land factor into social movement activism, especially during an era when people are talking about self-determination and raising questions about that. And eventually, my raising of questions and searching through various scholarship led me to the Republic of New Afrika, and not really knowing what that was, I just plunged in, and the rest, I guess, is history.
Well, thank you all. I'm really honored to join you. I had a chance to move back to Detroit to care for my parents. And one of the things that I knew was that everybody I knew in Detroit grew food. But you wouldn't have heard that or seen that represented in any of the media that portrayed agriculture or food production in the city. So what does it mean, really? I was asking myself the question, what does it mean to live in a city of 140 square miles with no major chain grocery store? And so Rob Nixon calls slow violence, which is just sort of communities that lack access to nutrient-rich food outlets in a city of, you know, at that point, almost 1 million. And so what I became fascinated with, I met Baba Malik Yakini, the executive director of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, as part of a 67 Rebellion conference that we were holding. And what I learned from Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and Baba Malik was a whole language. There was food security, food sovereignty. This wasn't anything I studied in school. And so I was really fascinated by what happens when community members take matters into their own hands and convert vacant lots and create spaces of art, music, nutrient-rich foods, intergenerational exercise and interaction. And then it also asked the question, who can afford to be healthy? And so I was fascinated by the ways that people took control of food as a strategy of resistance and resilience to grow a food system, create a food system for themselves, for their families, but also, more importantly, for the community. And so this work taught me that food was being used as a strategy of freedom, working toward community health and wellness. And I had to ask myself the question, like, okay, y'all, this can't be the only time we've ever done this. And so what we know is that at historic moments, Black folks have returned to agricultural movements. And yet the narrative has often been one of a deficit: slavery, tenant farming, and sharecropping. Well, how can you encourage, or how do you return to something if the deficit is all there is? And so working with folks in Detroit and the expanded food movement of Black folks, I became conscious of not just how do we move from stories of food as oppression, but food as liberation and freedom. And so what that also led to was a conversation that food is just the beginning. And if we could talk about controlling an alternate or creating an alternative food system, then what else can we do, right? Can we also talk about community policing, community education, community health and wellness, mutual aid, and looking out for each other? And so all of this was really the beginning of what became Freedom Farmers, rooted in community and wanting to link our history of resistance and resilience through food.
Thank you all. What a great way to start. And just many of you know I can relate everything to Rosa Parks, but just having Monica talk about gardening and Rosa Parks being a huge gardener when she moves to Detroit, right? And that's not the image we have of Mrs. Parks. So this is the part of the evening where you all get to teach us. And so what we want is for each of you to give us a window into your book. And how it changes or expands or challenges how we see the history of Black power, the kinds of freedom dreams people pursued, the work of liberation they did or they thought needed to be done, the kinds of portals they found to do that work, land, internationalism, the role of the press, food, community building. And we're going to start with you, Duas.
Yeah, so let's reinterpret the Black press. We know it well as this source about Black people, providing news, especially at times when white media's resisted any honest coverage of Black people. But what if it was also a source of our gendered identities, right? We know the Black press well as an organizer and mobilizer of Black people through various editorial campaigns, the Double V campaign, most people know about in the 1940s. But, you know, what if the Black press was also an organizer and mobilizer of crises intended to motivate Black men to stand up and be men? And if so, what did that mean? What were the contributions and costs of the long Black freedom struggle if Black people fully embraced and acted on the gendered identities constructed and promoted by the publisher of some popular newspaper? So this is what my book gets at. Let Us Make Men. So I foreground the discursive and ideological work of Robert Abbott through the Chicago Defender, W.E.B. Du Bois through The Crisis, Marcus Garvey through The Negro World, Robert F. Williams through The Crusader, and Malcolm X through Muhammad Speaks. And so I recast these men, you know, familiar names to a lot of us, as pivotal newspaper publishers at a time when Black newspapers carried tremendous influence in the Black public sphere in order to uncover the gendered dimensions of Black political thought, organizing, resistance, which for all of these men I just named, called for proper Black manhood to fight for racial advancement. So you get this compelling story of rights, rhetoric, representation, media, masculinity. Their clarion calls for Black men to stand up and be men were critical to the success and limits of the 20th century Black freedom struggle. So now to be clear, there were different models of manhood, right? And these models shifted over time. They shifted based on region. What counted as proper masculinity in Chicago in 1919, for example, was not what counted in Montgomery in 1955, for example, right? So sometimes there were multiple models of masculinity competing at one time. And this is where the Black press was crucial. It could turn an idea of manhood into an ideal of manhood, right? It could promote one model over another, could displace all the others. But then the ones that got displaced could return in later decades, right? So these processes, of course, led to consensus, to contestations, to contradictions, so that the vision for racial advancement was at times democratic, at other times patriarchal, sometimes radical, sometimes conservative, sometimes liberating, sometimes limiting. And this shows that our need and effort to produce and reproduce race men is not a biological process, right? It's a discursive, a fraught, discursive, and intellectual one. So what does this do to our understandings of Black power? So keeping in mind that Black power meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people at different times and still does. What is it to learn that the highly masculinized rhetoric of Black power was not invented in the 1960s with the Panthers, for example, but was inherited through decades of gendered discourse that had been generated and promoted in the Black press since the turn of the 20th century? What is it to learn that our conceptions of Black manhood, racial leadership, protest emerged from an empowering and problematic masculine discourse brought to us by this seemingly unassuming source, Black newspapers and their publishers, something that we typically don't associate with Black power consciousness and politics. And what is it to learn that this mass consumed product, read weekly, sometimes daily, had this kind of power, right? That it had this kind of power to shape the 20th century Black freedom struggle into a fight for racial justice and Black manhood.
Yeah, for me, early in my research on Black power activism, I focused, as I mentioned just a moment ago, a lot of my attention on the Black Panther Party. And while I was doing research in that area, I came across a letter that Huey P. Newton had written to Robert F. Williams. And in the letter, you know, my memory will fail me, so I'm not going to go into too many details, but the gist was, Robert F. Williams, we don't think it's a horrible idea, but we do think it's premature to be talking about securing land when the US exists as an empire. And I didn't really know who Robert F. Williams was at that point. I think I was still in undergrad. Come to find out, he was the exiled president-elect of the provisional government of the Republic of New Afrika. And it made me start to raise some questions, right? Well, what is the Republic of New Afrika? I'm interested in land-based movements. Where in Africa is that? I've never heard of it, right? Some of the questions that I think many people have probably asked at some point or another. And so after some exploration, I learned that actually, yeah, this was not just the Republic of New Afrika or the provisional government of New Afrika, but the New African independence movement. And no one at that point had written a full history of it. And so I began to shift my research in that direction and started to think about how the existence of this New African movement caused me to raise questions about, as the Weston was saying, what does Black power mean? And in this case, Black power meant then and continues to mean, because the New African independence movement is still in existence, it was focused on self-determination. And of course, that also is a term that people have contested and that has meant different things at different times. And for New Africans, it meant that the goal for them was to seek political independence, territorial sovereignty and separation, and self-rule. And so I found that fascinating. It's like, wow, here's something in the United States of America. It is part of the Black Power movement and it's based in land. All of my scholarly dreams have just come true. So let me focus on this for a minute. And even more important, I think that it allows us to raise these questions that I don't think had been raised at the moment. And so one of the things is the provisional government came into existence in 1968. And everything I had learned up to that point was that by 1968, the civil rights movement had won, the Black Power movement was in full throttle doing its thing, changing everything so America could be great for Black people. And at that moment, we get a number of well-known activists, right? Not just, we have the Obedelli brothers, Gaidi and Imari Obedelli. We have people from the Revolutionary Action Movement. We have Queen Mother Audley Moore. And the thing for me that really got my attention was Betty Shabazz, all endorsing this Black government convention, signing their names on a Declaration of Independence. And it just opened up so many lines of inquiry for me that I thought it would be important that this gets some attention, some full length attention. And so, you know, just the question of power and attempting to gain power separate from the political control of the United States government. These are some things that I think research in the New African Independence Movement helps to add to the study of Black power. And then just another thing that I can say real quick is being interested in social movements, I found that a lot of the attention focused on, the ideas in iconography, really, I guess, big picture concerns, and very few studies that I had come across attempted to clarify the daily culture and lived experiences of the activists themselves. Now, this is where I get to shout out some of some of the scholars that inspired me, people like Dr. Robin Spencer, Scott Brown, Tracy Matthews, who were doing this work along with a few other people. And so for me, as someone who's motivated in part by a desire to learn from and carry on the best practices of the legacy of these movements, I see it as critically important to clearly explain the ideas and goals, but then to give as much attention as possible to how the people themselves made sense of the ideas on a daily basis, and how, in trying to make sense of those ideas, their lives are impacted. And in the way that I write about it in the book is, even as they're changed by the movement, they start to reshape the movement. So I think it helps us better understand just how social movement organizations and the broader movements themselves evolve over time and continue to impact people, even if the organization, the movement itself comes to an end, because the people do continue to do the work.
That's a great setup, Ed. Thank you. Because I want to talk also about, my movement, my research questions were rooted in movement. And so it was in hanging out with folks who were changing and challenging access to food and nutrition in a really sort of active way. But yet I was always, trying to understand, what was it that would encourage someone to leave a family for a cause they believed in? Like, what does it take to get off the couch and get into a movement and dedicate your life to it? And so when I was hanging out with D-Town farmers, what I recognized and appreciated was so much of what they did was for others, right? And so they would talk about, well, my kids are grown and gone, but I want to make sure that other children don't have to drink Takis and soda on their way to school. And so the question came from movement, because I asked the question in those in those conversations. My dad would always say, girl, make yourself useful. So in those meetings and spaces, I was like, oh, but let me figure out how I can take what they're doing and find an anchor or a history or a context within which to understand. And so this, starting in Detroit, then took me way back, right? And thinking about how we braided seeds in our hair for the Middle Passage, right? And so it was like, there are all kinds of moments when we've used food as a strategy of resistance and resilience. And what I wanted to say was, what we're doing today is an extension of what we've done before. We braided seeds in our hair. We demanded provision grounds and slave gardens. We had Congo Square, where conversations of agency, Black spaces for our languages, our traditional religion, and celebrating Blackness. But at the same time, I feel like we used food as a way to sort of bring us together, but also to trade, to barter, to build, and as a demonstration of that agency. So what I began to ask the question was, what does self-provisioning allow us to do as a resistance strategy? If I can, and I mentioned Reverend Wendell Paris, who says you can free yourself when you can feed yourself. And I was mind blown. I was like, oh, wait, because I think one of the questions that we tend to ask is, oh, what do you feel like eating? We don't really understand that when we give control over the nutrition, the cooking process, who grew the seed, who grew the food, what was the fertility of the soil, that kind of thing, that we've abdicated some responsibility of our care to someone else. And so I, started digging and asking some questions, and fell in love with looking at Black cooperatives and collectives that go way back to the late 1800s, the Colored Farmers Alliance. And I was like, wow, they were able to 8 million farmers throughout the South. I don't use farmer in the USDA form, right? And so what I'm saying as a farmer, because often a farmer is defined as your relationship to the land as an economic determinant. I'm talking about the people who provide the labor. So I use it as a broad explanation. And so I was really fascinated, like, what have Black agricultural cooperatives and collectives, what have they done? And what are the ways that they have sort of moved forward the conversation of Black power? And so I had a dissertation chair who asked me this question when I first started. And the question was, I was studying autobiographies, and he asked me, he said, well, pay attention to what you see and what you don't see. And I'm like, I'm trying to get out of here. What you talking about, what I see and what I don't see? Who's got time to look for what you don't see? But how profound that statement was, because what he asked me to do was to listen to what the conversations are and to ask whose voices are missing. And so as we can think about the work of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, particularly, where are the voices of the farmers? I kept asking the question, how can you have a movement without people who provided your food? Thinking thoughtfully, like if you think about just the language and the scholarship around civil rights movement, we know a lot about the Panthers, we know about the students, we know the lunch counters, we know the music, but what about the farmers and why have their stories been told? And so the question came to me, is like, when the Freedom Riders went down south, who was feeding them? Who was housing them? And why is that so muted? And what do we do when we don't ask, what else is there to this story? And so we know the urban bias, we know a northern bias, especially those of us who study migration. Why do we only study migration from the perspective of those who left, right? And so asking these questions, I started digging and asking, what would it have been like had we listened to George Washington Carver? Had we listened to Du Bois's work on cooperatives? And as problematic as he is, Booker T. Washington, right? If we had listened to centering agriculture and self-sustaining entities, where would we be? So I just want to end this part of it where I talk about sort of putting the Black power, putting the Black farmer back into Black power. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, Kwame Ture talks about how he was introduced to the concept of Black power at a commencement address, right? Then he goes to Mississippi and he's like, oh, wow, this is really different. It wasn't until he got to Lowndes County where Black farmers provided safety, they provided housing, they provided food security, that's when there was an embodiment of what Black power means. It was when he met farmers Matthew and Emma Jackson, who offered the Freedom House in Lowndes County, especially given with traveling back and forth. And so I just have always wondered, how can we have a story without anchoring that which is necessary for our very survival and honoring the centuries of Black folks who have built the world's economy and have done so much, but yet their resistance and resilience has been virtually ignored, overlooked, and muted. And I wanted to elevate and unearth those voices.
I'm so faded into listening. Like, oh yeah, and me too. I wrote a book too. Okay, so just amazing. I feel like I'm learning so much. But yes, in terms of my book, Love for Liberation, how does it expand or change the way we think about Black power? For me, I definitely came into consciousness in the 90s and the early aughts. And, our vocal and newly woke Generation Z, they're embracing Y2K and they're embracing that era. And there's a couple of things that I hope that we don't embrace. And one of them is the hyper-masculinity of the time and the misogyny of the time. And put those as a slash, those as one. And then two is the queerphobia and transphobia of the time. And I think and I was an activist doing a lot of human rights advocacy in Central America and in Cuba. And I was really, as a queer femme who is Caribbean, Latina, and African-American, looking for a way that I could see myself in the work that didn't feel so compromised, didn't feel so erasing. And so what was so helpful to me about this project was discovering that that question of intersectionality was always a part of Black Power and the work that the activists were doing. I mean, you have brought up, Ed, Huey Newton. Huey Newton wrote a letter basically to the male Panthers, folks are nodding their heads, talking about questioning his own homophobia and acknowledging that, you know what, part of my problem with the homosexual is my questioning of my own sexuality and my own masculinity. And that honestly isn't a gay brother's problem. So we all really need to hang that up, right? And so to understand that there always was this challenge to, it wasn't perfect. Obviously, there was gender inequity in the movement and there was homophobia in the movement, but that there always were LGBTQ folk who contributed to the movement and who were open, people like Bayard Rustin. And Bayard Rustin is now being sort of like recast as a respectable civil rights figure, but that doesn't seem to be accurate historically in terms of how he articulated himself. James Baldwin, of course, very much supportive of the Black Power movement, very much involved. So there's that element that is part of this question, part of my exploration in an explicit way. And one of my happiest moments as a scholar was actually putting that index together and making sure, oh yeah, there is an LGBTQ entry in the index, and there are many pages. And in all of my research and great work that had been done before, I had not seen that. So I think that is one way that expands our understanding of Black Power, is that it's not something that was only led by or contributed to by men or straight men in particular. Also, I think that there has become, for a number of reasons, this hard line articulated between civil rights and Black Power. That, civil rights, is one thing and Black Power is another. And in my work, I look closely at 3 Black Power organizations: the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Malcolm X's Organization of Afro-American Unity, and the Black Panther Party. And of course, people think of Black Power, the first thing they think of is the berets and the women marching in Oakland, which is amazing and iconic. But people tend to kind of like the early SNCC, where they, had made a very deliberate decision to dress in their Sunday best with their Bibles and their homework and go do sit-ins peacefully. The later SNCC that, went on a trip funded by the great Harry Belafonte, who we saw in the video earlier, to talk with leaders of African independence about what kinds of self-determination they could affect. That post-Stokely saying Black Power, popularizing the term, but not coining it, that SNCC kind of gets faded out in our, Black History Month portrayals and our diminishing curriculum around Black history in public schools. That's another panel. But so another thing that my work does is really restore the blurring of that boundary, because what many people who were involved in civil rights, of course, most iconically, as you brought up, Monica, the Rosa Parks, the THEE Rosa Parks, right? Is that, she was like, yeah, that was great. Integration was great. It's not enough. So I need to do my yoga and I need to get my gardening, and we need to think about in Detroit how we can organize for ourselves among ourselves. And so that leads me to kind of, I think, the third major intervention. So many, I taught Black Studies at university level for many years, and so many students came in with just an earnest, complete misunderstanding of what Black Power meant. They really thought it was the same as white power, in the sense that if there's Black Power, someone has to be subjected, right? And, just outright, and they would share with me outright lies that they had been told by K through 12 professors about Malcolm X, about Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, right? And, things that they said and what they believed just wasn't true, And so I think my work really highlights that the goal of Black Power, of course, there's a 10-point program by the Black Panther Party, but overall, the key thing is self-determination. And that is what these organizations had in common with African independence. It's not about putting anybody else down. It's about setting a healthy boundary. right? And having the resources to decide for yourself as a community, what is best for you, right? Doesn't require anybody to be less. It questions how some people have more, right? But it's not in of itself hostile or combative. And so I think those are the three things that I hope, people that advance our discussion about Black power. But I think especially for young people, I hope, and I talk about this a lot in the epilogue, I hope that especially young people who are, maybe the most awareness they have about anti-racist activism is through Black Lives Matter, is that social movements happen in cycles. And, Black power folks that I interviewed, they really thought the revolution was happening tomorrow. And they put themselves all into it with that belief. And although everything they hoped for, everything that they aimed for didn't happen, and they made some tremendous sacrifices to effect those changes that they did, just because a social movement cycle ends doesn't mean it's over. And now so much of what we see in Black Lives Matter and the queer Black women co-founders of that movement have been very clear about the influence that Black power leadership has had on their work, including going to the United Nations and basically calling the US onto carpet as a systemic human rights violator with racial injustice. So it's okay if we don't get every solution by the weekend. Right. And of course, when we're younger, we have such a tremendous sense of urgency because, and it's not wrong, it should be over now. We should have racial justice today. Right. But the work of striving towards it still gets us in the right direction. And it's really helpful and reasonable to be hopeful that organizing works.
That was so powerful. It's been such a joy. I've been taking notes furiously, so many gems being dropped by our panelists this evening. I want to send a note to the audience and just let you know that, we want to hear from you as well. So please do tell us where you're from in the chat. Some people have already shouted out Harlem as well, and give us your questions, right? These panelists are really giving us some deep knowledge and some different perspectives on this very important period and allowing us to think about it in a very long range view, allowing us to think about it from many different perspectives. Now I want to turn back to the panelists and ask you about making these connections and the urgency of now. How does the history that you write about, the struggles that you focus on, and the activists that you profile, give us ways to think about where we are today in this country and social movements today? In other words, how does this history change or challenge our understandings of the history of Black power, where the United States is in 2022, and most importantly, where do we need to go from here? And I'll start with Ed.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I'll just begin by repeating something I said a moment ago, which is the New African Independence movement is ongoing. It is something that even though people were harmed, sometimes greatly, because of state repression, the formations, the central formations, such as the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Afrika, which I highlight most in the book, continues to work toward its goals. The New African People's Organization and the Malcolm X grassroots movement, they also continue to be very active and produce quarterly news journal. And then there are formations such as the Rebuild Collective that produces a high quality publication several times a year. So I definitely recommend that people look into those if they're interested in seeing what's happening now. And that's not even to mention the activity that occurs through the Jericho movement, a formation that imprisoned New Africans created in 1998, in which the PGRNA, that's the Provisional Government, and the New African People's Organization, activists from both of those formations helped actually bring into being. And this is actually getting toward my point about the implications for today. There are a lot of political prisoners that, from the New African Independence Movement, from the Black Panther Party, from the American Indian Movement, white anti-imperialists, right? Environmental activists, Black Lives Matter activists are catching charges, going into prison. So there's a need to continue to focus on political prisoners and keep them as central to anything we do as we possibly can, even if we are working on other issues. And so, yeah, Jericho, I mentioned Jericho just a moment ago, it's dedicated to getting justice for political prisoners and prisoners of war. And relatedly, there's a Spirit of Mandela International Tribunal that occurred last October that brought people together from various movements and nations to, and I actually wrote this down, I'm quoting here, to quote, they wanted to charge, quote, the United States government, its states, and specific agencies with human and civil rights violations against Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. The United States was found guilty on all 5 counts, and that's the end of the quote. They do have a website, the Spirit of Mandela, and you can see what the 5 counts are. And so these are just a few of the efforts that are connected to the people who I focus on in the book. And I mention them because I want us to talk, I want to just encourage us all to keep political prisoners central. And I'll come back to that probably again, but they also demonstrate the endurance of Black liberation. I really appreciate what Robin just said. This happens in cycles, right? So there's endurance that people demonstrate, and as they continue to carry on the legacy of that Black Power era that we've been talking about and that we've all written about, they remind me that activism is difficult and dangerous, most especially when historically oppressed people are attempting to create fundamental changes to a national and international system of racial capitalism that uses them as the primary commodities and essential labor resources to exploit. And of course, we see now that with the advent of with what these tech companies are doing, right? They mine us all for data and sell our private information. So I guess we're all commodities at this point. But the point is, that some of our folks continue to pay for their role in this dangerous work. And so we know some of the names like Mumia Abu-Jamal, and I want to highlight Mutulu Shakur, who groups like Malcolm X Grassroots Movement are campaigning to free from prison. And there's a Mutulu Now, Free Mutulu Now campaign that people can, if you just do Free Mutulu Now, you should be able to find a link tree that has a number of different resources that people can use to learn about who Mutulu Shakur is, why he's in prison, why we call him a political prisoner, and why we are trying to get him out. And one of those efforts to get him out is through demanding clemency. There's a petition that people can sign demanding clemency for Dr. Mutulu Shakur, as that's something that I think activists will be interested in. It's also something I think that we as scholars can be interested in, and we can use our positions of relative privilege to endorse, get our organizations, our academic organizations to endorse, and really help to spread the word. Because when we use the moment, this very crisis-ridden moment, to focus some attention on people who have been fighting this fight for decades now, oftentimes behind the walls of these incarceration camps, it helps us understand clearly what the stakes are, but also hopefully inspires us to, despite the odds, continue to carry on these struggles for liberation. And I'll just say one more thing real quick, because Monica made me think about this, right? About the importance of the farmer. There actually is this publication that I've been looking at recently. It is produced out of the New African Independence Movement. It's called To Survive. And specifically, it's something that the security forces had produced. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because there's an image on all of the covers that has what is supposed to be a soldier-looking person, and over one shoulder there's a rifle, on the other shoulder there's a hoe. And the idea that, yeah, you can't free yourself until you feed yourself. Once you get self-determination and control over the land, you don't have to be dependent on somebody who hates you to be responsible for your nourishment. Once you control your nourishment, you can start to resist in ways that aren't possible when the hand that feeds you is also slapping you all the time, right? And so I'll end there. I just think that these are some considerations that I take seriously at this moment. I hope we all can take seriously as we try to continue carrying on this legacy of Black Power, the Black Power era, and the elders that continue to guide what the work that we do.
Come through, Ed. Yes. So it was like the perfect, like, you know, we're on a volleyball team and you got me. I'm grateful. So I love what you both have said. And I think it illuminates two areas that I think my work does. One, I think that we often say that movements aren't successful if they don't do what they intended to do. And I think as social scientists, I think we should think differently about what success means and what success looks like. I had a student who started working with me on Mrs. Hamer's work who did something they weren't asked to do and came in and said, I think we may be overstating the case. That student hadn't heard anything about Freedom Farm and then questioned, was this actually something that was significant? And of course, I had to then, do a few things, but what I wanted to really emphasize was that Mrs. Hamer did what she did in that moment in time. And then Baba Malik Yakini and the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and other Black activists picked up the baton, learned from Freedom Farm, and are now engaging in those kinds of activities. So how do we define success, and what does success look like? And how can we think about success as moving the conversation forward, as I think what Robin, you were saying, instead of saying it's an all or nothing, you either accomplish it or you don't, but it's our responsibility to take those lessons and to bring them forward. I genuinely don't think that there is much more important than the topic. I wrote it down. I'm quoting George Washington Carver, who said there's probably nothing more important than the topic of food. George Washington Carver said that. Do we hear that about him? No. And so I think that when we think, I don't know how we have moments and conversations about what justice looks like without land justice and food justice, stolen land and stolen labor. And so, COVID hit and, white neighborhoods were looking at the shelves that were bare. We are already familiar with similar kinds of things that have happened in our neighborhoods forever. And so what I think is the beauty of the work that is rooted in what's happening now in this, people are asking questions about where their food comes from, how is it treated? Organizations like the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, I'm a member of, we started Black Academics, which is a conversation and providing scholarly, academic, intellectual contributions to movement folks. I just really feel like it's important, especially as Black folks are returning to the South, returning to air property and air land. Like there's a conversation that's happening right now that hasn't happened in the 100 years since George Washington Carver, Booker T. Washington, and Du Bois's conversation about cooperatives is so critical. So, what's important in this moment is looking at the organizations that are engaged in creating community-based food systems and identifying ways to move around the Piggly Wiggly and around the corporate entities to make sure that there is a regenerative food system, one that is not extractive, but that is regenerative. Those resources generate throughout that community. And so I think what's also important as we're facing climate change and all the other kinds of catastrophes, climate catastrophe that hit us harder, how do we anchor our freedom work in existing Black institutions? The work of Reverend Heber Brown out of Baltimore, the Black Church Food Security Network. Literally, the church goes down south, provides financial resources for Black farmers, make sure they have the money for the seeds, the labor, and then sends a bus, the trucks to send it back to both. Like, people are doing really incredible work around food. There's some new scholars that are coming out that are hot and happening, some through UNC Press and, you know, the wonderful folks in the Justice, Power, and Politics series. There's some really important critical conversations that are happening in food. The scholars are following it. The movement is involved in it. Communities are following and becoming involved and engaged. And I think it's worthy for our understanding. I think that the more you're concerned about food, it asks you other kinds of questions, right? So if I'm asking about where my food comes from, then that means I need to ask about the land. Then I ask questions about the water, air, and it makes me realize that I'm part of an ecosystem, and it's necessary for me to see myself as part of the system. You don't just do it and then it goes away, but how do we have shared ideas around what it means to make decisions about seeds, air, water, right? What does it mean for us to be active and involved in political ways in organizations where we're still fighting for our political voice to be heard? What does it mean for us to create an alternative economic model, one that allows us to barter, to exchange, to trade in ways that doesn't center the capitalist system that doesn't work to our advantage? So I think that there is a lot of opportunity. I just really would like to see us engaging more with each other, because the truth of the matter is that those that are trying to maintain and retain power, they're united. We're, we fight for schools, we fight for education, we fight for transportation and healthcare, and we go on all. No wonder we're tired. If we are finding ways to unite our struggle under one umbrella, what an amazing transformative opportunity that creates. And so then we can agree with George Washington Carver that food becomes that critical conversation, that important subject, one that really undergirds all of our work.
It's so such a helpful question. Where do we go from here? And I think, certainly the activists, the most impactful activists that are featured in my book are, started the revolution in here. And it's something that, I think when I bring up, people push back against because it seems like it's selfish. Like, to be a revolutionary is something that we're supposed to be doing for the people, all caps, right? Not really clearly defined, right? And then we wonder why, fixing everything for everyone doesn't work, right? But as people who are indoctrinated in self-hatred, and all Black people still are, right? Most of what we receive in mainstream institutions is not an accurate depiction of our culture, our contributions, our history, our wealth. So the revolution to me begins within. How do you feel about your Blackness? And activism, whatever the answer is to that question, your choices in activism can begin to improve that in your home, in your existing organizations, on your block, by actively building community and contributing to the activism that is already going on. So a lot of times, people will ask me like, well, what can I do? And it's like, well, have you thought about what's going on your block, in your neighborhood? What are people already doing to make things better in ways that would directly help you? And do you know any of them? Have you said hello? Do you hang out? Do you support? It really, for people like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael and Kathleen Neal Cleaver, it really began with that. Who is around, who's helping out? I want to contribute and participate. And then their activism and their contributions grew over time. So I bristle at the way we sort of have this iconography of the great Black leaders, as important as they are and were, as significant as they were, as heroic as they were, because it sort of alienates us from seeing what we have in common with them. Right? Like, to think about, Rosa Parks just, out of nowhere, she decided to, stay. No, that she'd gone to Highlander Folk Center because she knew people who were involved. I would like to get involved. She trained, she prepared herself. It was a practice. They had conversations, maybe Claudette Colvin, no, right? That is something we actually can identify with. Oh, she took her time. She volunteered. She got to know people. She got mentorship. She was trained. right? And that's just one example. There is a nuts and bolts to doing this work, and it starts very locally when it's most successful. So, for everyone who has been kind enough to join us tonight, you're wondering where we should go from here. I would say on an individual level, how do you feel about yourself and your community, and who is helping people like you feel better right around you in your everyday life? And I will, trust me, they exist. They may not be coming up in your feed on Instagram or Facebook because they don't have money for that kind of reach, right? But it doesn't mean that they don't exist. And so my second answer to that question in terms of where do we go from here is offline, right? The revolution, yes, there is helpful activism and networking that can happen, on our social media networks, but the real work of building the trust and confidence and friendship that is the cornerstone of every great movement needs to happen in person. And now we are coming back out, right? We're feeling a little bit more confident. We can go outside and hang out outside, right? We can go to the park. Having those face-to-face experiences of community participation is a really, really big part of how any movement has succeeded. So those would be my two things. Be honest about how you feel about you. Get involved with people who are working to improve that, and go outside and see people face to face.
So yeah, to all of these points, which I wholeheartedly agree with, I'll add three. So my work illuminates the promises and problematics of Black political mobilizations around strictly issues concerning Black men, right? So historically, this has helped animate Black political thought and Black activism, but it's also helped compromise broader visions of racial advancement, where there are opportunities that could otherwise produce real Black liberation when more voices, perspectives, and leaders are included rather than excluded by gender politics. So we see some of this, for example, happening now, some of the critiques that have come against Black Lives Matter, right? That it's mobilized around slain Black men. And these mobilizations are important, right? But what if there could be a roll call of all the people, Black men, Black women, trans women, so forth, who have been slain? So when we take the case to the public, this roll call mentions all of the names, shows all of the faces that have been slain by state and vigilante violence, right? Second, the book highlights the ways in which media has long served as a powerful tool for Black people in the quest for Black power. It's helped enable Black power. But that said, media is a double-edged sword, right? So it's also been a powerful tool of white supremacy. So media remains one of those pivotal white power structures that Black freedom struggles today must resist, but also find ways to access. To influence the public sphere. And then finally, I try to reveal how fundamental and foundational gendered ideologies are to how we formulate identity, leadership, rights, citizenship, rhetoric, political power, and fully understanding all of those things, I think could help activists counter another movement for masculinity that's happening right now, right? So the redemption of white manhood and the white nationalist state. So, from the perspective of Black people, we are always trying to grapple with the granular parts, the minutiae of Black power, right? The consciousness, the politics, the exercise of how do you act it out? How do you culturally express it? Do we reform the system or dismantle it? So we're trying to work these things out. But on the other end, the onlookers think we've already worked this out. They think that that we're already organized, already mobilized, and we're ready to move, right? So maybe we have more Black power than we might actually think.
Powerful. Thank you so much. The audience has shown up and shown out from Berlin to Brooklyn. We are in the house tonight. And the questions have poured in, and I'm just going to dive right into them because our time together is coming to a close. So the first question is from Dr. India Jackson, who just finished her dissertation on Black Power. Where can scholars of Black Power find community? Where can scholars of Black Power find community? Anyone who wants to dive in and answer that should do so.
I'll go ahead. I went home. You know, from Detroit, I went home. I wanted to be able to ask and answer questions and be familiar with the place, the time, the context, understand the history. I just came back from Detroit, and I'm just ever so grateful of the city that made me. And so I think you really start with, I feel like, Robin, you were saying, you know, sort of ask yourself where you are and how you feel. Where do you feel? Where do you commune, right? With whom are you in community and conversation? I feel like asking yourself outside of yourself, where are you, who are you, and how do you then expand that and find the ways to actually find a natural, organic, pardon the pun, organic sense of community and sense of belonging.
Thank you, thank you. Anyone want to add on to that? That was a fabulous answer. Home, home, home. We are rooted.
Yeah, I would just add to the question of Detroit too. There is a wonderful activist conference that takes place in Detroit every year. The Allied Media Conference. Yeah, Monica's like, I know what you do. Yes, the Allied Media Conference. If you cannot stay in Detroit long term, which I also recommend, if you can't do that, you can go to this conference and meet all kinds of people from all over the country and the world that are interested in sort of Black power in context today. But I also think your question, which is a very important one, speaks to there's scholarly community and then there's Black community. And sometimes it overlaps, like the Schomburg, you got everyone's laughing like, girl, you done said it. I said it out loud. Right. And so some places, you know, there's some rare spaces like the Schomburg where those two things overlap in a beautiful, you know, pro-racial justice way that is, and it's intersectional and it's lovely and it's a public institution. But oftentimes in the academy, we are segregated from Black communities. So I think it's helpful to have a two-pronged strategy of building community for yourself. One, as a scholar of Black history, specializing on Black studies, especially in Black power. And that's, you know, going to, what's the Progressive History Conference? It's shameful, I don't know. Is the Organization of American History? The OAH is the more, are we allowed to say out loud which one is? You know, there's both of those. I don't want to get anybody in trouble.
Is the one, but there's so many. I mean, American Studies is fabulous.
Yes, and there's the African American, the AAHIS. Yes. So there are a lot of specific organizations that focus on Black history and building community among Black historians. And then there's also the larger history community. Also, the American Studies Association conference has a lot of people who do Black studies. So there are conferences that you can go and sort of get your network on and meet people in the scholarly field who work on that. And then I think it's important to go outside and just be with everyday Black folk who have their sort of everyday practice of building knowledge. And some of that knowledge is just not fully available within the academy, or is just now beginning. Like if we counted on scholars to tell us about people like Crystal LaBeija and Pepper LaBeija, like we really would be in trouble, right? So now the ballroom scene, of course, now, you know, there are so many people doing scholarly projects on it 40, 50 years after it started. So it's just important, I think, for me. It was very sustaining when I was a scholar full time. It was sustaining on a personal level and a scholarly level to just be on the ground in Black neighborhoods, in Black community spaces, to have that community for myself. So I just think it's a two-parter.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to add that, you know, in so many ways, Black power gets repackaged and people tell you what it is, right? And oftentimes what they tell you is so far removed from the movements and struggles of the 1960s and their legacies. So Chef Falani has a question that kind of brought that to mind to me. Is BET considered part of the Black power movement? Can we include the millionaires, the politicians? How can we think about class, perhaps? Or how can we think about unpacking this Black unity concept? Is every Black sort of quote an advancement, really a Black advancement, we can say? Thoughts on that? The Weston, you look like you have something.
Yeah, I'm trying to, oh, 1 second. Okay, there we go. Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. Right, I do think there's room to include Black, let's say, Black excellence in that framework of, let's say, financially successful or a professional class, right? And certainly because I examine media, I think BT and other platforms too can be included in the ways in which Black power has reinvented itself in different ways since the classic 1960s and 1970s era. Recent work that's looking at Black lawyers. I mean, most recently, Civil Rights Queen, for example, right? That's looking at a Black professional woman, Constance Baker Motley, who is a lawyer and is transformational to an extent, right? And so I think part of looking at, let's say, a BET or Black professional class on one hand, does symbolize Black power in those areas, but it also, I think you have to ask the question of, like, to what extent are these figures transformational? And it requires an expansion of what Black power is or was. So I think if you ask those kinds of questions, yeah, there's room for what we might term a Black professional class in that sense. BET, the billionaires, right? But then you still have to ask this question of if we're juxtaposing it with the classic definitions of Black power, redistribution of wealth, redistribution of land, of resources, power. Is that the same thing that's happening with that Black professional class? So something along those lines, right?
Thank you.
I would, if it's okay, I would echo everything that you said to Weston. But first, making a little bit of joke, one of my favorite Gen Z terms is rapitalist. And that kind of became viral when there were certain folks who, of course, were put on by the Black community who supported Donald Trump's reelection, despite his, at best ambivalence about the white supremacist displays before January 6th, about the white supremacist displays in Charlottesville a couple of years ago. And they use the term rapitalist to describe people who, came from the rap community, who were put on primarily by Black people and then crossed over. And, part of their usefulness to the entertainment industry in particular is their ability to mobilize not only us in numbers, but the cultural capital that African Americans have to make things cool, right? And so despite the fact that how they made their money came from us and their purported interest in racial justice, when it came down to it, they just didn't want to pay that much in taxes, right? And so I think that the Black power perspective was one of power to the people. It wasn't power to the millionaire. It wasn't power to the billionaire. It wasn't power for me in Brentwood. Shout out to Nicole Brown Simpson and her children. It was about how do we democratize, how do we cultivate our own resources, which are abundant, for the community good. And so I think, the first BET, which is started by the Johnsons, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Johnson's part kind of gets faded out in history, that was a Black business. And that was a Black business that was kind of guided by a respectability politics, at least during the day. At night, it was a very different BET, but that's another panel, right? Robin's like, yeah, after dark, honey, that was something else, right? And so, right, that was a very different BET, but it was an autonomous Black press space in which you saw things and discussions of things and people being heralded that never would be heralded at the Grammys, on CBS, et cetera. Now the BET Awards, because BET is part of the Viacom CBS family, the BET Awards were put on CBS and VH1 and MTV simulcast simultaneously, right? And so I think it's an interesting and important question, because we need resources to get the land back. We need resources to be able to fund our artists. We need resources to be able to invest in our nonprofits. And so resources are helpful, but at the same time, everyone who has access to resources doesn't necessarily have a Black Power ideology or Black Power motivation. And so I think it's okay to sort of disaggregate those things, like resources for Black people, that's great. As Harry Belafonte famously did a few years ago with Jay-Z, sort of called Jay-Z on the carpet and saying, in our generation, we felt obligated to speak out about racial justice, invest in the Black community, because Black people were how we have money. Aretha Franklin said, I am donated to the Free Angela Defense Fund because Black people are how I have anything to give in the first place. And so Harry Belafonte kind of said to Jay-Z, we had a sense of accountability because Black people were why we were where we were. Why don't Black people hold people now in our position, the Black excellent, hold their feet to the fire in the same way? And so I think that's just also part of it, is as a community, if we appreciate our value and we know that people are in leadership positions from our community because of their authenticity and their bond with us, maybe we should be asking for more in exchange for that bond.
Thank you. Thank you. We only have time for one more question, and I think just a briefest of responses, but this was a great one. I couldn't let this one go past. From Onaci Muid. Can the panel discuss Pan-Africanism and the international aspect of Black Power, perhaps connected to Durban Conference, UN Decade for People of African Descent, and the larger question of reparations? So tell us about Pan-Africanism in a nutshell, and its connections to Black Power.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So one of the places where I like to start with this question is how people in the New African Independence Movement have framed themselves as not African Americans, not Black Americans, but New Africans, an African nation held captive in the Western Hemisphere. And I like to start there because that is partially, well, I should say in no small part, informed by the legacy of the UNIA and the fact that some of the elders who helped found the provisional government of the Republic of New Afrika were UNIA members. And they felt a deep allegiance not only to African people in the United States of America, but also to African people all over the world, not least people on the continent of Africa. And so the way that translated in the people, through the people who I've studied, is they actively sought to create diplomatic relationships with African nations. One of them being Tanzania, where Robert F. Williams was staying at the time that the provisional government was founded, or around the time. He might have arrived just after. I might have the timeline off just a little bit. But and so in thinking about Pan-Africanism, I think about some of the ways that it was framed in the early 20th century moving forward, as if you liberate the continent of Africa, and how people like Kwame Ture continue to talk about it for quite some time. If you liberate the continent of Africa, if they are truly free from colonialism and are able to govern themselves and make decisions about the resources on the continent, what happens to the people on the continent, et cetera, then they will be in positions of power to help protect African people who have been dispersed, right? Through the Caribbean and South and Central America, in the United States of America, and elsewhere. And so I think that the topic of Pan-Africanism is something that it is something that has factored into my research in some ways. And it's something that I think we can continue to talk about because the question of reparations has also come up. And there have been efforts by African people in the Caribbean through N'COBRA. I saw somebody was shouting out N'COBRA just a moment ago, which I have to say it, you know, Imari Obadeli, Nkechi Taifa, Chokwe Lumumba, et cetera, helped to found. There have been efforts of African people all over the world to work together to hold the United States, to hold Europe accountable for the damage that they've done through slavery, colonization, et cetera. And the more that we can highlight those connections and act to advance those connections and the goals of those various movements, the better we'll be.
Thank you. This has been a tremendous conversation. Thank you to our speakers, to Weston, Monica, Ed, and Robin. Thank you to our audience. What an incredible conversation in the chat. Thank you to Cynthia Norman and Billy Sanders for the ASL interpretation. Thank you to Novella and Kalila for all of the work behind the scenes. We again are back on the first Thursday of April. That's April 7th. We're going to be talking about slavery, capitalism, and American Empire with Adam Getachew, Peter Hudson, Justine Edwards, and Daniel Immerwahr. Again, that's April 7th. And for our whole kind of season, you can go again to blackfreedomstudies.org. You can follow us at Schomburg CBFS, and we'll look forward to seeing you in April. Good night.